They laughed when she raised her hand, laughed harder when she didn't lower it. $3? For him? Someone jeered, spitting tobacco at the dust. Mira didn't flinch. She kept her eyes locked on the man in chains, taller than the others, beard matted, shirt torn, wrists raw where the shackles bit his skin. The auctioneer blinked, confused. "Ma'am, he ain't fit for—" But she nodded once. $3. A pause. Then the gavel dropped. Sold. The crowd groaned, disappointed they wouldn't get to see him whipped for sport. Mira stepped forward with her coin purse. She didn't speak, didn't explain. She just paid, then turned to face the man the town called the Bear of Craven Hollow. He didn't meet her eyes. He just stood there, chest rising slow and heavy, the sun glinting off the dried blood in his beard. "Bring him to the wagon," she said quietly. No one offered help. Two boys shoved the man forward. He stumbled once, then caught himself. Walked barefoot. Shackled. Mira followed. The town had already moved on to the next spectacle, a pregnant woman selling her wedding ring. By the time they reached the wagon, the mountain man stood still again, silent as stone. Mira untied the lead rope and motioned to the back. He didn't move. "I won't ask twice," she said. He climbed in. She drove. They left the noise behind, wheels creaking as they turned toward the woods. The man didn't speak once. He didn't touch her, didn't growl, didn't blink, just stared ahead with a stillness that unnerved her more than violence ever could. By nightfall, they reached her cabin. One room, sloped roof, fence barely holding. She opened the door and pointed inside. "There's water, a cot. I'll sleep in the barn." He didn't move. "I don't owe you kindness," she said, tired now. "But I don't owe you cruelty either." Then she left him there, lit a lamp in the barn, curled up on a bale of hay, and exhaled for the first time all day. Her body ached. Her hands were blistered from holding the reins too tight. And her hair was still tangled, still damp with sweat, still braided in the back by her own shaking fingers before dawn. The next morning she found him sitting on the porch, unshackled. He'd freed himself. Could have left, but hadn't. And on the railing beside him, folded with care, was her brush. Mira didn't speak when she saw the brush, just stared at it. Clean, polished, with a few strands of her dark hair still tangled in the bristles. She hadn't used it in days. It hadn't left the shelf beside her bed. Which meant he'd entered her room, gone through her things. Yet nothing was missing, nothing broken. Just the brush, sitting like an offering. She turned her gaze to the man sitting on the porch. He watched the trees, legs braced wide, arms resting on his knees like he belonged there, like the shackles hadn't just come off the day before. "You touched my things," she said, her voice low. He didn't answer, didn't flinch. Mira stepped closer, forcing steel into her spine. "Why didn't you run?" Still nothing. She studied him then, really looked. His face was rough, brow shadowed, but his eyes, they weren't wild. They were tired, soaked in something ancient and heavy, like he'd seen too much and carried it all behind his ribs. She turned and walked back inside, the brush clutched tight in her hand. She should have been afraid. He was twice her size. He hadn't spoken once. And yet she felt no danger. Only questions. That night, the fire burned low. Mira sat on the edge of the porch, hair down her back like a rope of knots and weather. She tried to work through it with her fingers, but the strands caught, twisted, resisted. Her shoulders slumped. She was too tired, too worn to fight even her own hair. Then she felt it. A shadow behind her. A hand, calloused but slow, reaching over her shoulder. She didn't move, didn't breathe. He took the brush from her lap, sat cross-legged behind her, and began. Not fast, not rough. Each stroke was deliberate, slow enough she could feel the care in it. She closed her eyes. Let him work. The knots unraveled, one by one, the pull never harsh. He separated the strands like they were sacred. And then he began to braid. 3 sections, over, under again. His fingers were sure. Mira sat frozen, heart hammering. No one had braided her hair since her mother, not even her husband. She swallowed hard. He didn't say a word. When he finished, he tied it off with a bit of twine and rose, walked away without touching her skin. And she sat there, stunned, with a braid down her back and tears in her eyes. Because for the first time in years, someone had handled her like she was real. He didn't sleep in the cabin. Didn't ask for food. Didn't touch her. In the days that followed, Mira watched him from behind the kitchen window as he rose at dawn and walked the edges of her overgrown field, checking fence posts, dragging fallen branches, repairing what no one had asked him to. She still didn't know his name. He didn't offer it. But his hands moved with purpose, like someone who'd once built more than he broke. She left a bowl of beans and cornbread on the porch rail that first morning, expecting it to go cold. But by noon, it was empty. No thanks. No scrape of dish. Just the quiet understanding that passed between 2 people who owed nothing, yet offered something. The braid stayed in her hair for 2 more days. She didn't dare undo it. Not because of vanity, but because of what it meant. She caught herself reaching up, fingers tracing the knot he'd tied with twine. Not tight, just careful. One night, as the wind rolled in and the lantern flickered, she stepped outside with a blanket in her arms and found him sitting against the barn wall, sharpening an old blade. "Do you speak?" she asked. He looked up, held her eyes, and shook his head. "Once?" "Not a lie, just a boundary." Mira nodded slowly and set the blanket down beside him. "Gets cold out here." He blinked once, then returned to his blade. But when she turned to leave, he tapped the dirt once with the flat edge. She paused. He pointed to the moon overhead, then to his heart, then tapped his lips and shook his head again. Not just mute, scarred. Whatever had taken his voice, it hadn't taken his soul. She swallowed and sat beside him, careful to keep a foot of space between them. The wind tugged at her braid. He reached up slowly and tucked the end back over her shoulder. His fingers brushed her collarbone. Just once, and then pulled away. That night she didn't sleep in the barn. She lay in her bed, fully clothed, listening for footsteps that never came. But before she closed her eyes, she whispered into the darkness, "Thank you." She didn't know if he heard, didn't know if he'd understand. But when she stepped out the next morning, the porch had been swept clean. And a new length of twine, fresh, strong, looped with a single red bead, lay folded on the rail. By the end of the week, the town came knocking, not with fists, but with eyes. Curious ones. A traveling peddler had seen the mountain man chopping wood outside her cabin and spread word that the widow had tamed the beast no one dared claim. Mira heard the murmurs at the trading post. Must have broken him with a whip. She keeps him chained at night. That brute? She'll end up dead by winter. She said nothing, just tightened her shawl, paid for her salt and soap, and walked home without looking back. He was there when she returned, splitting logs with a rhythm that didn't waver, shirt off, muscles tensing and releasing like a machine made of breath. The old her would have looked away. But now she watched. Not for desire, but for proof. proof that the man they feared wasn't what they said. When he saw her, he nodded once and set down the axe. She walked past him into the cabin, opened her palm, and showed him the red bead she'd found on the porch that morning. He didn't reach for it, just touched his chest, over his heart, then pointed to her braid. She felt the warmth rise to her cheeks. "You made it?" He nodded. "For me?" Another nod. She didn't know what to do with the softness that flooded her, so she set it on the windowsill, beside a chipped porcelain mug, and left it there like a prayer. That night, while the stew simmered, she sat on the porch steps with her hair loose over one shoulder. The man, still unnamed, still silent, came to sit behind her, unprompted. He began again, gently, slowly. The brush moved through her hair with reverence. Then the braid, tighter this time, threaded with the new twine, the bead placed near the base like a seal. Her eyes closed. When he finished, he rose, but she reached back without looking and caught his wrist. "What did they call you?" she asked softly. He didn't pull away. He crouched beside her and scratched a single word into the dirt with his finger. "Creel." She read it aloud. "Creel." He nodded once, then walked into the dusk. That night, Mira sat alone in her bed, with the braid still tight, and the name echoing through her ribs. They'd called him Untamable, but they didn't understand. Wild things aren't dangerous. They're just waiting to be seen by someone who knows how to sit still. The snow came early. By October's second week, frost clung to the windows each dawn, and Mira had to pile extra logs in the stove just to keep Levi's toes warm. Except there was no Levi anymore, just empty echoes of what might have been, and a baby blanket she never brought herself to throw away. Creel didn't ask, didn't look at the cradle in the corner, but once, when she stepped out to gather eggs and returned to find the blanket folded neatly on the rocker, she knew he understood. That was the first time she wept behind the barn. Not loud, not long, but deep, from somewhere her words had never reached. Later that day, she found the chicken coop reinforced with new planks. The hammer he'd used lay to the side, still warm. Creel never took credit, never waited for thanks. But she left a second bowl of stew on the porch rail that night, and when he picked it up, he left behind a single feather tied in red twine. It hung from the cabin door now. She didn't ask what it meant, didn't need to. In town, the talk changed. Not quieter, just different. "He's still there?" Maybe she drugged him. Mountain men don't stay put. But he did. Day after day, Creel chose not to leave. He had no chains now, no debt, no ties, just quiet chores, steady hands, and the softest gaze she'd ever known. One night, Mira took her braid down before the fire. Her fingers moved slow, almost unsure. She stared at the hearth, at the place where Creel usually sat sharpening his blade. He wasn't there. The door creaked open. She turned. He was behind her. No axe, no brush, just a bowl of warm water in his hands. He knelt before her, not asking, just waiting. Her chest ached. Slowly she nodded. He dipped the cloth, wrung it out, and lifted one of her bare feet. She gasped, not in pain but in disbelief. He washed it gently, thumb smoothing over calluses, heel to toe. Then the other. She didn't look away, didn't speak. When he was done, he dried them both, then pressed his forehead to her knee. She felt it like thunder in her bones. Not ownership, not worship. Something quieter. Something that said, "I see you and I stay." Mira's hand moved without thinking, resting lightly atop his head. And for the first time, she let herself believe he wasn't hers. But he wasn't leaving. The first snowstorm hit hard. Wind howled like ghosts through the pines, and the fire crackled loud enough to drown out memory. Mira wrapped her shawl tighter and sat by the hearth, staring at the empty chair across from her. Creel hadn't come inside yet. He'd gone to secure the chicken coop hours ago and still hadn't returned. She told herself not to worry. But worry bloomed anyway, slow and thick, until she opened the door and stepped into the snow. "Creel!" she called, voice catching on the wind. No answer. The cold slapped her bare arms as she trudged toward the barn. And there he was, just inside the doors, seated on the ground, his arms around the youngest goat. Its side was torn, bleeding into the straw. Creel looked up. His face was calm, but his shirt was soaked in red. Mira rushed to his side, falling to her knees beside them. What happened? He didn't speak, just pointed to the wall where claw marks scored deep. "Cougar?" she whispered. He nodded once. She swallowed. "You fought it off?" He tilted his head, then tapped the goat's neck gently. Protected it. Not himself. Mira blinked fast, the cold forgotten. She pressed a hand to the goat's trembling side, then to Creel's. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head, but she saw it. Blood on his sleeve that wasn't the goat's. She reached for his arm. He flinched, just slightly. Mira paused. "I won't force you," she said. "I never will." His breath slowed. Then it extended his arm, let her roll up the sleeve, revealing a deep gash along his bicep. She cleaned it in silence, the way he had once cleaned her feet. Her hands didn't shake. His eyes never left her. When the bleeding slowed, she wrapped it tight, tied it off, and sat back. The goat was sleeping now, storm still raging. But in the barn, there was only stillness. "You never asked for my trust," she said quietly. "But you earned it anyway." He blinked, expression unreadable. Then he reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a strand of twine. New, smooth, threaded with 2 beads this time. One white, one red. He handed it to her, closed her fingers around it, and rested her hand against his chest. No words, just a heartbeat. She didn't pull away. She didn't need to. The wild man wasn't wild at all. He was the storm she'd feared, now standing between her and the cold. The storm lasted 2 more days. They barely spoke, not out of distance, but because they didn't need to. Mira cooked. Creel mended. He carved something in the corner by lantern light while she watched from her rocking chair, her braid undone, her fingers curled around the twin beaded cord he'd given her. When the winds died, the world outside looked born again, pure, white, blank. And yet, Mira felt more seen now than she ever had when things were loud. That morning, she took down the mirror above her wash basin and set it on the floor beside the fire. Then she sat with her back to it and unbraided what was left of the last plait he'd woven. Her hair was longer now, darker from winter oil, softer somehow. Creel looked up from his carving. She didn't ask, just looked over her shoulder once. His eyes met hers. And he stood. He sat behind her on the floor, knees braced wide, hands still rough but sure. He dipped the brush in oil and began again. Slow strokes, each pull of the bristles like apology, like promise. She closed her eyes. Let him move. She could hear the fire crackling, the snow sliding from the eaves. When he reached the nape of her neck, he paused. Then gently, he parted the hair. Over. Under. Over. His fingers threaded her story into place without a word. When he finished, she could feel it. Not just the braid itself, but the quiet that wrapped around it. He tied it off with the cord she had clutched all morning. 2 beads nestled at the base of her spine. Her breath hitched. She turned to face him. "Creel," she whispered. He didn't answer, just waited. "If you had the words," she asked, "what would you say to me?" He didn't move at first. Then, slowly, he reached for the carving he'd been working on. It was a woman, seated, her hair in a long braid down her back. He handed it to her, then touched the wooden braid, right where the 2 beads sat. And then he reached out, touched the same place on her own braid. She looked down, then back at him, and suddenly she understood. Not words, a place, a presence, a home. Mira lifted the carving, placed it on the mantel, and stood. She didn't kiss him, didn't need to. She just reached for his hand and held it. They stood like that, 2 figures carved from silence, with snow falling softly beyond the window, and her braid heavy with all the things he could never say. By the time Mira returned to town, the snow had thinned, but the rumors hadn't. She walked into the trading post with her braid heavy down her back and Creel at her side. Conversation stopped. The clerk froze mid-measure. One woman gasped loud enough to echo. Mira didn't flinch. She stepped forward, laid 2 coins on the counter for flour and kerosene, and looked the clerk in the eye. "We'll also take sugar," she said. "Winter's not through." Behind her, Creel said nothing, just stood tall, hands relaxed, eyes scanning the shelves like they weren't full of fear, but items. The clerk swallowed and nodded. "Yes, ma'am." The other shoppers parted. Not because they respected her, yet, but because they didn't know what to make of a woman who brought a mountain man to market and wore her hair braided with his silence. On the way out, a boy gawked openly. "Is he yours?" he whispered to Mira. She paused at the door, turned. "No," she said, "but I'm his." The boy blinked, confused. She didn't explain, didn't owe it. Back at the cabin, the snow had melted in small pockets where Creel had dug drainage lines. The porch was swept. The chicken coop held fresh straw. Her life, once cracked with cold and grief, now pulsed with quiet rhythm. That night, she baked bread. Real bread. Not the stone-dry crust she used to choke down alone. She handed Creel a slice while he sat by the hearth, sharpening a new tool he'd fashioned from scrap iron. He took it, nodded once, and broke it in half, offering her the larger piece. She accepted without a word. When the fire dimmed and the cabin dipped into stillness, she brought out the hairbrush again, sat beside him, loosened her braid, turned her back. He moved instantly, like he'd been waiting. The strokes this time were slower, not cautious, cherished. He rebraided without asking, and this time, at the end, he tied in something new, a 3rd bead, small and blue, nestled between the red and white. Mira touched it lightly. "What's this one?" she asked. Creel tapped the blue bead, then tapped her chest, then his, then the hearth, then the door, then the cradle. Her throat tightened. A home, a family, even if broken, a fire, even if small. She turned, hands trembling slightly, and rested her forehead against his. "You're not untamable," she whispered. "You're just too wild for cages." His eyes closed. And in that moment, they didn't need any more words. Spring crept in like a secret. Soft mud beneath snowmelt, the first flicker of green along the cabin's steps, birdsong piercing silence with shy joy. Mira noticed the change not in the trees, but in herself. She no longer waited for him to leave. She no longer flinched when she opened the door and found no one outside. Because Creel always returned, always came back with something useful. Bundles of firewood, a rabbit already skinned, a pine needle pouch stitched from hide. But more than that, he returned with stillness. Not the heavy silence of grief she used to carry, but a quiet that filled the cracks between her ribs and asked nothing from her except breath. One morning she stepped outside and found him behind the barn, building something. Not just mending, but shaping. Boards lined in a neat stack, stones laid in a circle, a garden bed, wide and waiting. He looked up when she approached, didn't pause, just handed her a packet of seeds, beans. "You want me to plant?" she asked. He nodded, then pointed to the earth, then to her braid, then to her hands. She understood. You build with what's been broken. You plant where there's been loss. Together they tilled soil with their fingers, dark and wet, until her knuckles ached and her heart felt cleaner than it had in years. They didn't speak, not even once. But by the time the last seed was in the ground, she found herself humming, an old tune her mother used to sing while stitching. Creel didn't react. But later that night, she found a flute carved from hollow reed resting beside her pillow. The same tune echoed in its shape. She brought it to the porch, played the first 3 notes, and laughed. Sharp, sudden, real. Creel looked up from his stool, eyes steady. She met his gaze. "Do you remember your name?" she asked softly. He didn't answer, just tapped the flute, then his chest. "Creel is enough," she said, "but if you ever remember more, you can give it to me." He reached over, took the end of her braid gently, and placed it in her hand. She looked down. Another new bead, green this time, nestled between the red, white, and blue. She looked up sharply. "Green?" He pointed to the dirt beneath their feet. Life, roots, growth. "You're braiding me a story," she whispered. Creel didn't nod, didn't smile, just lifted her hand and pressed it to his heart. And for the first time she believed she wasn't just surviving. She was being written into something that might last. Summer came with warm wind and long golden days. Mira no longer counted time in weeks or losses, but in changes she could touch. Rows of beans stretching toward the sun, the way Levi's cradle had become a shelf for carved animals, and how her braid now held 5 beads, each a color, each a chapter. One morning she woke to the sound of hammering, not frantic, not loud, but steady. She stepped onto the porch in her shift, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Creel was building. Again. Only this time it wasn't a fence or another woodpile. It was a table, wide, low, smoothed at the corners. She raised a brow. He tapped its surface, then pointed to the doorway. "For inside?" she asked. He nodded. "For what?" He looked at her, tapped her braid, then reached into his coat and pulled out a final bead, deep amber, almost gold. He held it out, but this time, waited. Mira stared at it. Her fingers closed around it slowly. "What does this one mean?" Creel stepped forward, lifted her braid in both hands, and for the first time, he didn't braid it alone. He handed her half, and together they wove. Over, under, together. When they tied it off, the gold bead sat at the base like a seal. "What does it mean?" she asked again, barely a whisper. He touched the side of her face, traced the line of her jaw, and then wrote in the dirt with his finger. Belonging. Mira blinked. "To you?" He shook his head, then tapped her chest, then his, then the cabin. To both. That evening she cooked for 2, and for the first time, set the table for 2 chairs, not one and a stool. They ate in silence, but a warm silence, the kind that stretches between people who don't need to fill every breath with sound. After dinner, he brushed her hair again, as always. But when she stood, she turned to him and held out the brush. "Your turn." He paused, then sat down. She ran her fingers through his thick, dark hair, slow and steady, just like he'd taught her without words. She didn't braid it. Not yet. But she touched it with the same care, the same reverence. When she finished, he stood, pressed his forehead to hers, and for once he closed his eyes first. The man she bought for $3 had never been tamed. He'd simply found a place where being wild was no longer dangerous, and she, tangled, scarred, steady, had found someone who could braid her story into his without needing to own it. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more soul-deep stories here on Echoes of the West. If someone braided your hair without saying a word, would you let them touch your story too? Tell us in the comments.